Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Intercultural Insiders and the first episode where I'll have a guest. My name is John McGraw, and I help expats and newcomers feel confident in their new country in less time and pain. I am the founder of Hiyaku Coaching, which is focused on helping people adjust to new cultures and the challenges so they can have long term success. And just a reminder that the purpose of Intercultural Insiders, this show, is to share the stories of people with intercultural experiences. So if you're watching or listening and you're feeling isolated or lost, hopefully you can hear something from the guests' experiences that could help you and remind you that you're not alone. And more importantly, if you can take one thing away from this show, it's to understand that rising to the challenge of adapting to another culture means that we can become better versions of ourselves. Now, today, of course, as I mentioned, is my first guest, Liliana Nakamura, who is an HR consultant and mentor for newcomers to Canada. She has a multicultural background, which you'll get into the interview, and she has years of experience working in Argentina, Japan, and Canada. She has, of course, because of all of these experiences, she has a valuable perspective on adapting to different cultures. And as a side note, some of you may already be aware, she's also my wife. So I'm very happy to share with all of you just how incredible she is, really, with all of the things that she has accomplished and how she continues to give back to the community and help others along the journey that she's had herself. So before we get into the interview, there were a couple of highlights from the interview that I wanted to mention. How her parents raised her to be aware not only of the culture that her parents came from or from the local culture that she was born and raised in, but also to be aware of the world around her and the cultures around her on a deeper level. And this, I think, really helped her to set herself up for success later in life. And this is something that I really emphasize in my coaching as the first step to success, which is activating your cultural awareness. It's getting a deep understanding of not only other cultures, but really your own culture and how it affects your way of thinking, that it's just one way to view the world. And when you have that awareness, it makes it much easier to understand other cultures and to adapt to them and to really have that long-term success that you can't get from just having a list of do's and don'ts when you're visiting another culture. And I think also another takeaway from this is the importance that Liliana will mention later, the importance of making connections in a new culture and getting out of your comfort zone and avoiding staying with your own cultural group and connecting with other locals to adapt and succeed. Now, this is the first part of a two-part interview. And as was mentioned in the description of the episode, it is recorded. But for everyone watching live, and of course, this is me talking live right now, you can comment and ask questions in the chat. And I will be available to answer, highlight questions, show them on the video. Liliana, I believe, will also be joining us as well. So she will also be able to answer questions in the chat and respond there. So it will be really interactive, even though the interview, which is about 20 minutes in length, is recorded and it's part one. So again, I will show comments on the screen and answer them in the chat, and Liliana will answer as well when she can arrive. And for the last few minutes or so of our time today, there will be a bit of time for a wrap up and a preview, of course, of part two. So without further wait, let's get into part one of the interview with Liliana Nakamura. Welcome, Liliana. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
It just seemed natural to have you as the first guest based on the experiences that you've had from your background and the places you've lived and the kind of work that you do. But rather than having me talk, why don't you go ahead and tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Okay, sure. I can tell you about my life and my career. I was born and raised in Argentina by Japanese parents. Both of my parents were Japanese immigrants in Argentina, and I grew up there. I graduated university in Buenos Aires and worked for a few years there at the Japanese embassy in Argentina. That's when I got an opportunity to go to Japan for work. My original plan there was to stay for maybe 2 years, maybe three, but I ended up staying for 12 years. I can expand on that later. And in Japan, I worked in the government and also got into HR consulting. I also did my MBA from McGill University, which is the Canadian university. And after that, in year 2012, I moved to Toronto, Canada, and I continue working here in the human resources field. So that's a quick snapshot of my life so far.
Yeah, thanks for the snapshot. I think it gives us a really good sense of the experiences that you've had. And now, of course, I want to take a little bit of a deep dive into some of those details that you mentioned. And I think for many people, the idea of Japanese immigrants in Argentina might be a bit surprising depending on where the listeners are from. Maybe you can give us a little bit more of a context about that.
Yeah, actually, there are many immigrants in South America. So, Japanese people who moved to South American countries, mainly Brazil and Peru. But Argentina was also receiving immigrants after the Second World War. And that's where you see a lot of Japanese communities in those countries. So I guess my parents went into that stream and they got attracted by the South America, which maybe sounded really exotic for them. But yeah, you see a lot of immigrants, and now there's maybe fourth and fifth generation of Japanese people there.
Let's get a bit more into your own background. So, what was it like growing up in a Japanese family in Argentina?
When I was growing up, my parents spoke to me in Japanese at home, but they also mixed Spanish words because they had studied Spanish and they were living there, working there. And my parents made sure that I learned Spanish as well because it's the local language. They brought the kids to play with me in the neighborhood, or yeah, they really made sure that I was acquainted with the local language and the culture. And food was also like a mix of Japanese dishes and local Argentine dishes. So it was different, I would say. Somehow, from a young age, I knew that my family was a little different than from the other kids' families. But my parents explained that, and I think they really wanted me to be part of the Argentine society. And that's where they also made friends with neighbors and local people. So yeah, that's what I can say. They were really trying to expose me to both cultures since a young age.
I can see how being raised that way with that exposure to those cultures must have had a significant influence on you. And what would you say was the maybe the most important thing that you developed from that?
That's a good question. I think I built a lot of awareness that like you can be in a society or in a country, but then there's this outer world, there's other countries in the world. From a young age, I was aware that there are many countries and different cultures. I remember as a kid having a world map, and my parents would say, oh yeah, here's Japan and we're here in Argentina in the southern hemisphere. And I would be really curious. I was always asking questions, and I got interested in other countries. I would ask, what are these other countries? And that got me curious and wanting to research more about different countries and cultures and languages. And I think that the worldview from that kind of bringing up, I think it gave me a perspective that I should be learning always. I should be knowing people and cultures, not from a superficial level, just like food or customs. I think my intent is always to get to know people and get to know what they think and what they experience, right? And different cultures from that perspective. And for example, I was very fortunate to be able to travel a lot for business and for pleasure. And in most occasions, I really tried to see where regular people living in those cities would hang out and where do they go and think and what would be their normal life. I really want to keep that. And I think that comes from how I was raised.
Yeah, so I can see that you had a lot of deep interest in the deep culture and the underlying values and the ways that people think. So, what would you say was maybe the most important thing that really stood out for you when you really started to explore those ways that people really lived and the way that they thought?
Mm, I think in a lot of ways, when I was living in Japan, for example, I could see the different ways of working and the beliefs, like a lot of things that really influenced how people behave. And in Japan, it's a very collective, consensus based society. A lot of the day to day behaviors that you see in the people and in the workplace are consensus based, and you really have to maintain the harmony and make sure that everybody's informed and so on. So going from a Latin country to a society like that, it was very different. And that's also like something that stood out. And I had to learn new ways of doing things and behaving. So that's one thing that I can mention in that sense.
So, I could see and hear that there would be a lot of adjustment. And I wanted to backtrack a little bit because, of course, you did mention earlier that you moved to Japan and I think it was 2000. So, what was it that motivated you to move to Japan?
At the time, I was working at the Japanese embassy in Buenos Aires. I was a cultural advisor, and there was an opportunity to go to Japan with the JET program. So JET is Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. And my role was to be like a coordinator for a group of teachers there, a group of foreign teachers working at public schools in Japan. So I got that opportunity and I thought it was the right moment to go and try something else. And I was very curious and motivated to go to Japan and live there, because my first time visiting Japan was when I was 11 years old. I went there with my mom and I stayed for a couple of months with my family or my mother's family. But that was like a visit, right? And then as an adult, I wanted to have a different experience and some work experience abroad. So that's where I saw the opportunity and I passed all the tests for that. Thought it was the right moment and I went with that program.
And of course, you had the exposure to Japanese culture throughout your life as you were growing up. And as you said, you've been working as a cultural advisor.
First 6 months or first year was really hard to get used to different lifestyle. It's not just the job. The job was pretty like adaptable. Like I was able to adapt, and then my coworkers were very supportive. But day to day life and dealing with the Japanese people was a culture shock because since I look Japanese and I speak the language very fluently, there were some expectations, right? To behave in a certain way or to show certain body language. And that was not matching the expectation, of course. It was certain reactions or certain people saying things not really adjusting so well. The first year was a little hard for me. Then the second year was okay. I think I got more adjusted, and also I spent time studying more of the language and getting more acquainted of the more modern vocabulary, because when I studied in Argentina, it was with like very old books and it was a very formal language. Then going there, learning the current vocabulary was also a process, right? So second year was a little easier, and then it got easier later.
So I see that there are more expectations placed on you. And interesting that you mentioned the language as well. So, with that adjustment, what's a situation that you recall that really stood out for you within that first year?
I don't know, there's different things like not understanding certain vocabulary. Maybe that was a barrier sometimes. In Japan, there's so many what you call gairaigo, words or expressions that are taken from other languages. And then people keep adapting those to the Japanese pronunciation, and they sometimes they shorten the words or they mix two words and put them together, and it's the Japanese word for something. Yeah, that kind of the language was difficult to get used to and to understand at first. I would read a text. So, for example, let's say I was trying to, I don't know, read some instructions, right? And I saw some words like they put area, right? Area is area in English, but I would ask my colleague in the office, like, why don't you say the Japanese word for this traditional Japanese word? Why do you put it in that like foreign pronunciation, foreign language? Or, for example, I would go to a store and ask for a certain product that I cannot find on the shelves. And the people there, the young people, would look at me and say, "What?" It's so not being able to convey and then having to explain. I was very frustrated.
Aside from language, in terms of the adjustment, I remember that you told me a story about giving a presentation to a number of retirees
Oh,
about that.
yeah. I went to a community store because some of my responsibilities were to present or introduce my country or my culture to Japanese people, right? There were a number of presentations I had to give at schools or community events or different places in that area where I was working at in that city. And at some point, I did a presentation on Argentina and was explaining, and I was really moving my hands a lot. Was that's how we speak in Argentina. We move hands and we use a lot of expressions, even facial expressions. And I was very enthusiastic about showing my country. But some of the feedback that came in written form, of course, in Japan, everybody saves face, right? So nobody would tell me something, especially if they just saw me for the first time. And yeah, some of the written feedback, a couple of sheets said it was interesting, but she moved her hands and it was a little aggressive in that the tone or the way of explaining. But that was a little shocking at the time because it was the first time I had heard or received that feedback, really.
Yeah, I could see how that could really be quite shocking adjusting to that feedback and the means of giving the feedback as well.
Yeah. I think there are reasons for that. And if everybody's behaving in a certain way and this new person comes from different culture, they use different body language. That's also a way to expose them to that type of culture. So in the end, I think it was positive.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it then. What would you say was the one thing that really helped you to adjust to Japan?
One thing that really helped me was to meet friends locally, right? So some Japanese friends, some were the spouses of my foreign friends. Just being able to have like local people and people who I could ask questions to, right? Some of my coworkers also became good friends, and that kind of helped with the adjustment. I also got to visit new places. I got to see my relatives there. So gradually, I think a lot of things helped me.
And then, of course, you met some weird Canadian guy, and eventually we got married. But your connection to Canada was actually something that happened even before we met.
Yeah. The thing is, around year 2003, 2004, so after 3 or 4 years in Japan, started to think, okay, what should I do next? And my idea was not to stay in Japan forever. I was comfortable. I was already working in HR consulting. I had a nice corporate job there. But had started thinking, okay, if I move somewhere else, where would that be? I didn't want to go back to Argentina because the economic situation was not great. And I wanted to explore more of the world. And I started looking at moving to the US or Canada. And actually, my condition was to be in an English speaking country in the northern hemisphere. Okay. Because I thought that, like, the northern hemisphere, a lot of things happen. And I was more attracted to the US or Canada, and at least to try it out. So that was one reason, a very personal reason. Another reason was that I had visited Canada once in 2002. And one of my good friends from Argentina, like we did high school together. She was living in Toronto. So she told me a lot of good things and she showed me around. So I knew Toronto at the time. Then another thing is that I completed an MBA from McGill University in Japan because they have a program there. So I got exposed to a lot of Canadian topics, and it's Canadian business. Textbooks are from McGill. So I had a lot of input around that. And I thought, okay, Canada seems to be better and a place to go. And I also saw that there is an immigration program, right? The Federal Skilled Worker Program. So I decided to apply in 2004, and I just sent my application and waited for actually for a long time. And then I met you in 2005. So that's also part of the reason was all the stars aligning to for me to move to Canada.
Welcome, Liliana. All right. So that was part one of the interview there. And in case you hadn't noticed, Liliana was showing up as LinkedIn user in the chats there. So she answered the question there. We have some technical. It's always interesting kind of learning the new technical side of things. So, yes. So I hope you enjoyed part one. It was very informative. And of course, I want to highlight that, as I said, this was only part one. So part two will be coming up next week. And in this part, of course, Liliana, it's going to be the same time, Wednesdays at noon Eastern Daylight Time. And this is going to get more into the start of her time in Canada and the role of networking. I think is one thing that she really focuses on, and especially the importance of having a plan or a roadmap to success. And I think that this is something that is essential for adapting to any culture. Is sometimes just moving to another culture you can learn from that, but really approaching it with intention, just like you would with any skill, your chances of success are much greater. I know from my own personal experience that I feel if I had had a plan when I first went to Japan, I would have been successful much sooner than I would have, than I was, in fact. So, if you want to know more about having a roadmap to success, I encourage you to contact me at Hyaku Coaching. So you can find me on thriveglobally.ca. And you can also contact me through LinkedIn, which you have as well. And you can reach me at John McGraw at thriveglobally.ca. Okay. And for those of you who I see that there's some questions are popping up, thank you for that. We're coming close to the end of the time. However, these questions, if you do type them now, then we can certainly answer them probably next week, as we have coming up, same time. And again, as the show is going on, you can type in your answers, your questions in the chat as the recording's going on. And as we want to make sure that being North Americans, we're very concerned about our time here and trying to be, start and end things on time. It's an important part of the North American mentality, I think. Another cultural aspect to consider. So again, for those of you who want to know more about Hyaku Coaching, I encourage you to check out my website, thriveglobally.ca, or contact me through LinkedIn or email me at john.mcgraw@thriveglobally.ca. So thank you very much for your time. I hope it was informative for you, and I encourage you to tune in next week to see the second part, to learn more about Liliana's journey and how she succeeded in Canada and the advice that she has for people who want to succeed in Canada. So thank you very much, and see you same time next week.